The 1920s roared with jazz, champagne, and dreams of easy riches. Cities were buzzing, industries booming. And for the first time, it seemed like anyone could strike it lucky. On both sides of the border from Toronto to New York, people poured into the stock market, convinced they were riding a never-ending wave of wealth. It wasn't just the elite anymore. Teachers, farmers, factory workers all were investing, borrowing on credit, and watching the numbers climb. Storefronts glittered. Newspapers sang praises of the new economic age. And the streets were alive with hope. There was an air of invincibility. The future looked polished, modern, and full of promise. But beneath the surface, cracks had already begun to form. People were buying shares with money they didn't have. Banks were lending freely, without safeguards. Wages weren't keeping up with the cost of living. And yet, no one seemed concerned. The mood was too giddy, too enchanted by the rise. It was a time of illusion, a dream fueled by unchecked optimism. The warnings were there, but they were drowned out by the sound of coins and celebration. In hindsight, the signs are painfully clear. But in those days, people weren't looking for caution. They were chasing a new kind of futurion that, tragically, would come crashing down far sooner than anyone imagined. October 1929 brought with it a chill far deeper than the weather. On the surface, the stock market had shown a few signs of strain, but nothing to cause panic, at least. Not yet. Then came Black Thursday. Investors began to sell fast. Nervous murmurs turned into shouts. Prices tumbled like falling dominoes. Still, some clung to hope. It had to bounce back. Didn't it? But it didn't. Just 5 days later, Black Tuesday struck with full force. The market collapsed. Stocks that once held dreams now held nothing but empty numbers. The ticker tape. And it wasn't just rich businessmen who lost. Ordinary families, those who had borrowed to invest, who had placed trust in the system, were hit hardest. Their life savings gone. Their hopes shattered. Banks closed their doors. Credit dried up. Employers could no longer pay wages. In cities and towns across North America, the crash echoed like thunder, loud, fast, and without mercy. What made it so devastating wasn't just the loss of money. It was the loss of belief in progress, in institutions, in the promise of modern prosperity. The dream had burst. And what followed was not just a downturn. It was a descent. After the crash, many thought the market would recover. Maybe not tomorrow, but soon. But days turned into weeks. Then months. And instead of healing, the damage began to spread quietly, relentlessly. Banks, once trusted pillars in every community, started to shut down without warning. People arrived early in the morning to withdraw what little they had, only to find locked doors and empty vaults. Their savings, built over years, vanished without explanation or apology. Factories, once alive with the rhythm of machines, went silent. Employers handed out final checks, then closed their gates. Families lost incomes overnight. Children were pulled from school. Rent couldn't be paid. Shelves emptied. Shoes went unmended. Meals grew smaller. In rural Canada and the American Midwest, the land itself turned against them. Dust storms swept across the plains, swallowing crops and killing livestock. Farmers walked away from fields they had worked for generations, now dry as bone. It wasn't just an economic collapse, it was emotional, spiritual. Communities felt hollow. Newspapers brought only more bad news. The government's response felt slow. Uncertain. Almost invisible. People felt abandoned. And yet, amid the shock, a new reality began to sink in. This wasn't a rough patch. This was a new era. The world people had known the booming 20s. The wide-eyed belief in progress and fortune was gone. And the path ahead? It looked uncertain. Bitter. And long. As the Depression deepened, the glitter of the 1920s faded completely. The luxury cars, jazz clubs, and rooftop parties became distant memories. In their place came soup kitchens, ration lines, and shared blankets. People who had once dreamed of growth began to focus simply on getting through the day. Conversations shifted from stock tips and new appliances to where to find the cheapest bread or who might be hiring for a few hours of work. The mood changed. So did priorities. In many homes, pride gave way to necessity. Families moved in together. Rooms were rented out. Old clothes were patched, repatched, and passed down again. Meals were stretched with creativity and hope. But something else happened. 2. Neighbors who had once barely spoken began to rely on each other. A pot of stew was shared across 3 apartments. A warm coat was passed from one child to the next. Churches and community halls became sanctuaries, offering not just food but dignity. This shift wasn't just about hardship. It was about humanity. People learned to listen more, to give without expecting, to carry each other. The belief in endless wealth had crumbled. But in its place rose something quieter, and perhaps more lasting, a belief in each other. In a time when the world seemed colder, hearts somehow grew warmer. It was no longer about getting ahead, it was about getting through. Together. By the early 1930s, despair had settled deep. But even in the bleakest corners, something began to shift. People were tired but also hungry for change. They had seen what unchecked greed could do. Now they wanted fairness, stability, and a future that cared for everyone. Not just the wealthy few. Governments, once hesitant to intervene in economic matters, were pushed to act. In Canada, public works projects started appearing. Roads were built, bridges repaired, forests planted not just for progress, but to put people back to work. The same movement echoed across the border in the U.S., where bold reforms started taking shape. These weren't handouts, they were lifelines. New policies offered a glimmer of hope: unemployment relief, minimum wage laws, better labor standards. For the first time, many workers felt seen. Mothers received food assistance. Children were kept in school instead of being sent to factories or farms. The idea was simple but powerful, that a country's strength lies not in its wealth, but in how it protects its most vulnerable. It wasn't a perfect fix. Corruption existed. Not everyone benefited equally. But it was a beginning. People began to believe that change was possible not just in boardrooms, but on kitchen tables and factory floors. A new vision emerged, one rooted not in profit, but in people. And while the pain hadn't disappeared, a different kind of energy started to take hold, built on rebuilding, reform, and the quiet power of starting again. The Great Depression didn't just reshape the economy. It reshaped people. In kitchens, on farms, and in factory lines. A quiet transformation was taking place. Those who had once counted on paychecks and promises began to rely on something far stronger: themselves and each other. Children learned to grow up faster. They took on chores, helped neighbors, and watched their parents stretch every dollar with astonishing creativity. They learned the value of sharing, fixing, mending. Their toys were handmade. Their stories were passed down, not bought. Parents grew more patient, more resourceful. A torn coat became a patched one. A broken table was repaired instead of replaced. Waste became unthinkable. And through it all, they modeled perseverance, and not the loud, heroic kind, but the everyday sort that shows up again and again. These weren't just survival tactics. They were life lessons. Across Canada and beyond, people began to define success differently. It wasn't about climbing the social ladder or owning more, it was about making do, staying kind, and not giving up. Even long after the Depression ended, those habits stuck. Many who lived through it carried that mindset for life, quietly strong, deeply grateful, always thinking ahead. They became the backbone of future generations. Not because they were rich, but because they were resilient. And in a world that had once felt like it was falling apart, that resilience became their greatest wealth. By the late 1930s, the dust had begun to settle. Though the wounds of the Great Depression would remain for years, something remarkable had happened beneath the pain. People had changed, and so had the country. The economy, slowly and unevenly, began to heal. But the true sign of recovery wasn't found in numbers or headlines. It was in the sound of hammers rebuilding homes, in children walking to school with packed lunches, in store signs that once read "closed" now replaced with "open." Families gathered around supper tables again. Fathers returned to work. Mothers, who had carried entire households through years of scarcity, were finally able to re-stiff only a little. But the legacy wasn't just recovery. It was renewal. Governments had learned that people mattered more than profit. Citizens had learned that progress means nothing without compassion. The Depression didn't just end, and it redefined what mattered. Those who lived through it didn't forget the hardship. But they also didn't forget the courage it took to endure it. They raised children to value work, community, and kindness. They became the quiet heroes of the next generation, ones who knew how to plant hope even in broken ground. Their story is not just history. It's a lesson in humanity. In how strength doesn't come from what we own, but from how we rise when everything's been taken. And rise they did. The Great Depression taught us that strength is not found in wealth, but in resilience. When the banks failed and the jobs vanished, it was not money that carried people forward, it was courage, community, and character. The lesson was never about avoiding hardship. It was about how we respond to it. Families survived not because they had more, but because they learned to live with less. Neighbors shared what little they had. Strangers became lifelines. In a time of scarcity, generosity grew. This chapter in history reminds us that we are more than consumers, who are caregivers, builders, and protectors. It showed that progress without compassion is empty. And it proved that the human spirit can endure even the harshest winters when it stands together. Today, that legacy lives on. In our grandparents' frugality, in our instinct to help a friend in need, in our belief that better days can still come, no matter how dark things may seem. In a world that still faces economic uncertainty, from inflation to job instability, lessons of the Great Depression remain strikingly relevant. They remind us to live within our means, to save when we can, and to care for those around us. When hard times hit, we must resist fear and lean into community. Whether it's offering support to a laid-off friend or buying local to support small businesses, every act of kindness matters. Invest in what truly lasts: relationships, resourcefulness, and resilience. And remember, no matter how uncertain the road ahead may feel, history shows us that hope, when shared, becomes strength.